I shared as the reflection for the Shema and then for the Amida this line, V'shinantam levanecha, and you shall teach these words diligently to your children, as a reflection. What is it that we would wish to teach our children? Or to frame it differently, what does religion have to teach? And to frame it a little bit with more edge, what is the role of a rabbi in being a teacher of the community? What is the dividing line between the teaching of Torah and politics? Now, we'll get to that question, but let me give you a little coming attractions. This week's Devar Torah by Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of England is on this theme of Pinchas, which he calls morality and politics, and asks this question: where does morality and politics overlap, and what's the role of religion in dealing with contemporary issues? I want to also share with you some teachings of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I'll touch on Elie Wiesel and focus on my own teacher as a child, Rabbi Moshe Tutnauer, and what I remember about his preaching. I pause to acknowledge I give 100+ sermons a year. Think about it. That's a lot of talking. And the challenge that I have links in a different way with our Torah reading, in that our Torah reading has a succession where Moses conveys power to Joshua to continue to lead the people. And that leads me to ask in the back of my mind, what advice would I have for a rabbi, for a younger rabbi, about what to preach about with all that talking? What is the value, the opening question of V'shinantam levanecha? What is it that we would seek to convey to our children, to our community? But the punchline will be for all of us, because all of us, whether we are rabbis or not, each of us is a teacher. Each of us is a leader. And we're left with a foundational question: what does religion have to teach? How does it matter in our lives to have a religious teaching, a moral teaching, or does it? And so let me begin at the beginning with our Torah reading. Parsha Pinchas is frankly a troubling moral teaching for our rabbis. The story. You recall from last week how the prophet Bilam said, I am a prophet for hire, but I can only say what God allows me to say. And ultimately, Bilam's curses that he had intended to say for King Balak, for which he was getting paid well, turned into blessings. Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places of Israel. But the end of that parsha, where the curses turn into blessings, is Bilam, according to the rabbis, giving Balak the following advice. Here's the path to make a difference in terms of the moral standing of this people. Allow your women to entice them, and that will lead so many of those men into the path of idolatry. And so it occurs at the end of the parsha that the Midianite women, and I'll pause to acknowledge that Moses is married to Tzipporah, a Midianite woman. The Midianite women begin to seduce the Israelites, and God is angry. And you know what happens when God gets angry? In the Bible, people start dying. And it says that there are 24,000 people who are now dying in this plague that God is bringing as a punishment. And then there is a prince of the tribe of Shimon. His name is Zimri. And Zimri takes a princess of the Midianites, Cosbi, and publicly, in front of all the people, ushers her into his tent to say, Moses and God, I defy you. I will do what I want to do. And Pinchas goes into that tent and takes his spear and kills the two of them. And with that, the plague ceases. And at the beginning of our parsha, named for Pinchas, we are told of God's response. Not only did it stop the plague, but he's told Pinchas, because you were a zealot for me, I will reward you, and you will be, as was your father, a priest in an ongoing way for the people of Israel. I will create with you a brit shalom, a covenant of peace. Except in the Torah, the word vav is missing. So we read it shalom, but the O sound isn't there, which for some rabbis points to this moral challenge. Here's why it's a moral challenge. If Pinchas had gone to a court and said, do I have your permission to go in and kill these two people? According to Rabbi Sachs, he would probably not have been given permission. In this case, Pinchas is a vigilante. He's taking the law into his own hand. Yes, God will approve of it. Yes, it will stop the plague. But still, it's an act of zealotry, of violence, that for the rabbis is a very troubling precedent. And so that's the opening of our Torah reading, Pinchas's reward. Next week, we will finish the reading of the book of Bamidbar, which takes the people to the edge of the desert and ready to enter into the promised land. And so the rest of this morning's parsha is preparation for the end of Moses' leadership, preparation for the people moving on as an independent people. There will be another census. There will be, for the first time, a description of the division of how the land will be divided, and the turning over of power by Moses to Joshua. Moses is not done being the leader of his people. He still has next week's parsha, and then an entire book, the book of Devarim, for the farewell. When Rabbi Sachs focuses on Pinchas, he says that there is a dividing line, but an overlap, between morality and politics. He defines politics there as a weighing of variables, of values, that is a discussion and a decision of we. It's a community decision of what to do. Hence, normally, in deciding whether to kill two people engaged in defiance or blasphemy before God, there would be a need for a process, a judicial process. And Rabbi Sachs emphasizes that in society, there are collective decisions that need to be made that come down to weighing values. And yet the focus of his Devar Torah this week is to emphasize the importance of morality as the underpinning of how an individual should weigh and community should weigh those choices. And he specifically focuses on COVID. And he says, writing from London, I am deeply impressed with how the world, the Western world at large, and not just the Western world, the Eastern world and the Southern world of Africa, has prioritized, he says, human life in terms of a response to COVID. He points out that in ancient cultures, human life was often not regarded with great value uniformly. Indeed, in that Bible story of the Tower of Babel, the rabbis will ask, well, what was so terrible about building a tower and unifying the people? And they will suggest that for the builders of the Tower of Babel, When a brick fell and slowed down the construction, the people would feel enormous anxiety and upset. But when a worker fell, they would just ignore it and keep working. What was the sin of the Tower of Babel according to our sages of 2,000 years ago? The failure to honor human life as being more important than a building project. And so that is what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks emphasizes, that somehow, and he celebrates this, the world has moved into a place where when the COVID virus is rising, to use his words, the priority was made for governments to decide as a matter of morality to save human life and to sequester people, to quarantine people, to make sure that people wore masks as our medical experts so guide us. And so he said, no doubt there's a political decision to make as to when to open, but the fact that the first reflex was to preserve human life and to do so with that as a priority and then to move forward in balancing economy with human life, he sees as a triumph of the values of Torah, which was not always the case. And so he teaches that the responsibility of religious teachers is to convey the centrality of morality as God's expectation, the preservation of human life, so that when decisions are made around economics, the moral question will weigh heavily. That leads me to a topic that's very much on my mind and that I would look to gain some guidance from you on. Namely, what do you see as the boundary lines between what a rabbi should and shouldn't talk about to the congregation? Is the role of a teacher of Torah to make people comfortable, or is it to challenge? They say of our prophets that their role was to comfort those who were in suffering and to discomfort those who were too comfortable. But is that really the guidance I should give to a younger rabbi or not? I remember one high holidays a number of years ago after a sabbatical, giving a sermon on my own struggle with the magic I had encountered of religious teachers around the world who I saw using religion as magic, including a chief rabbi in Israel who had said to somebody I knew, don't have surgery on your daughter for what seems to be a brain tumor. I believe that my mystical prayers have relieved the problem, which it had not. And I shared with pain my own struggle of what does it mean to be a religious person? And I remember later a congregant coming up to me with great upset. And she said, Rabbi, when I come to synagogue, I don't come to hear your problems, your challenges with God. I come to be inspired by you, to be uplifted. That was not a sermon I came to hear. Or was it? Is it the role of a religious people to talk about God? You know, when I was a younger rabbi, there used to be a rabbinic joke among rabbis, and they said when you're trying out for a job, there was the head of the search committee who said to the prospective candidate, they said, you know, when you come to give your sermons, we ask that you not speak about keeping kosher. Don't talk about kashrut. You're going to make people uncomfortable. A lot of our people don't keep kosher. If you talk about kosher, you're going to make them uncomfortable. And Rabbi, don't talk about the Sabbath and keeping the rules of the Sabbath. A lot of people here, they drive, they don't observe the Sabbath. If you talk about that, you're going to make people uneasy. So the young rabbi says, so what should I talk about? What do you mean, Rabbi? Talk about Judaism. Well, that leads to this question. As I and other rabbis think about high holidays, what is the role of a rabbi? What should a rabbi teach about? So I want to revisit my rabbi growing up, Moshe Tutnauer, who was larger than life to me. I was his captive audience, captive in the sense that my father took my brother and me to synagogue every Saturday morning for what for me was the ages 6 to 16. And maybe because of my age, but even more because of the quality of teaching and preaching of Rabbi Moshe Tutnauer, I can still remember his sermons, or many of them. Here's an aside. I can still remember him saying about him getting a haircut, that when they stop thinning your hair, you've known you've reached middle age. Whenever I get my hair cut, I think of my teacher and I smile to know that I have yet to reach middle age. We'll see when I get my hair cut on Wednesday if they thin it, but I expect they will. But I remember even more profoundly a high holiday sermon, for instance, that he gave in the midst of the civil rights movement. He had gone to Selma to march with his teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he said to the congregation, we talk about civil rights. And he recounted his marching. And he said, but how many of you have a person of color making the bed for your child? And how do you justify that you have the maid making your children's bed rather than them doing it themselves? And among your children, how many adults do they call by their first name? And how many of your children know your maid's last name? I could feel in the room as a young teenager the tension. This rabbi was clearly personalizing civil rights. He was clearly talking about human dignity and justice. And the people didn't always like it. He said to me years later, he said, Rabbi to be, the test of a sermon is, does it lead to a good lunch conversation? People don't need to agree or disagree with you. You must speak with integrity, the values of our tradition. And if you are successful as whether it's continuing to be a conversation, speak with respect, but speak from your heart the values of our teachers. I pause to read something from his teacher, and that is from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel, who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, was very active in the civil rights movement. He was also active in the Vietnam movement, and many people said to him, among the faculty and in the larger Jewish world, you're becoming a public person in a controversial area. Why do you have to put us into the news? You should stay out of it. And he wrote in a sermon he gave, in condemning the clergymen who joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in protesting against local statutes and practices which denied constitutional liberties to groups of citizens on account of race, a white preacher declared, the job of the minister is to lead the souls of men to God, not to bring about confusion by getting tangled up in transitory social problems. In contrast, unquote, in contrast to this definition, the prophets passionately proclaim that God himself is concerned with, quote, the transitory social problems, with the blights of society, with the affairs of the marketplace. What is the essence of being a prophet? A prophet is a person who holds God and men in one thought at one time, at all times. Our tragedy begins with the segregation of God, with the bifurcation of the secular and sacred. We worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. We think of God in the past tense and refuse to realize that God is always present and never past, that God may be more intimately present in slums than in mansions, with those who are smarting under the abuse of the callous. I had the privilege, again as a child, to hear Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel speak in my synagogue when my teacher, Rabbi Moshe Tutnauer, brought him to dedicate our sanctuary. Years later, I would begin to read Rabbi Heschel, and when I did, I could see him and hear his voice, for I had done so in person at an earlier point. And when we were getting ready to dedicate this sanctuary, I wrote Professor Elie Wiesel a letter. And I told him that story about how I had heard Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel dedicate my sanctuary. And I would hope that he would consider being that person for the children of our larger Orange County Jewish community and help dedicate our sanctuary. He wrote me back. We had known each other at the 92nd Street Y where I worked and he spoke. And he said, I will be there. Tell my agent what you can afford and whatever it is will be fine. He flew on a red eye to get here, and he flew back on a red eye afterwards. And we had the children of all of Orange County in this space dedicating this sanctuary for a public conversation with Elie Wiesel. When Elie Wiesel stood before Ronald Reagan and said to the President of the United States, I know you are about ready to travel to Germany, and I know that on your itinerary is visiting a cemetery where there are SS soldiers buried. Do not go. You have no place there. We know what those men stood for. It is not what you stand for. The moral act is not to go. Remarkably, in a conversation with Elie Wiesel later, he told me that the words he was going to share had to be approved in advance, and that President Reagan knew that he would be challenged publicly, and he still said, yes, let him speak. That speaks to the greatness of President Reagan, and it speaks to the greatness of Elie Wiesel. For Elie Wiesel in that moment saw himself not as a politician, he saw himself as a Jew, speaking on behalf of a moral tradition that had a history that mattered, a history that deserved to be honored. Where does morality end and politics begin? It's not always clear. But what is clear is that for teaching Torah to be relevant, it must deal with the real issues of the day. We have concepts like Bal Tashchit, you cannot needlessly destroy. If you are sieging a city, we are taught you cannot knock down the fruit trees, even in a war, because they have a future yet to be honored in producing fruit. And we are, by extension, told that we stand before a creator of the world and are partners with preserving as stewards this world. My question is addressing climate change politics or religion? In a world in which we are told, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that a stranger in your midst, including an Egyptian, you must love them, is addressing the challenge of how we treat the other, morality, or is it politics? Where are the lines? I invite you to guide me, to learn from you. In terms of my own preparations for high holidays this year, what do you feel you would like to hear? And where do you feel a line should be drawn? But my goal in sharing this is not just because our Torah reading deals with this topic of Pinchas, elucidated by Rabbi Sachs on the topic of morality and politics. It's not just because it deals with succession of responsibility of Moses to Joshua and my own reflection as a rabbi as to what a rabbi has a responsibility to teach about and where a rabbi should not go. But Where I go now is to say that each of us who are sharing in this service is a teacher to someone. Each of us is a leader to others, and more. Each of us leads and guides our own self to live a life in response to God's presence, in response to Torah, God's teaching, of rising to the occasion of saying, to be human, you must be more than human. Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. Ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, because holy am I, the Lord your God. And so, where I began, Vishinantam levanecha, and you shall teach diligently to your children these words. We recited as a centerpiece of our prayers in echoing the words of Torah. For you, what is a core value, a moral teaching that informs for you what it means to be a Jew, that informs for you what it means to be a spiritual person? And how does that moral teaching that lives within you get conveyed to those around you? How does it inform how you lead your own life and the political choices that you make as part of the we of a collective? Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, Abraham challenged you. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat? Shall the judge of the earth not do justly? Wow. Our tradition teaches that even you, God, have a standard of morality that you have to live up to be our teacher. All the more, Ribono Shalom, we know that your teachings are not of the past, that they are not feel-good only, that they are part of a collective quest to grow toward you. May we have the courage to know our convictions, and may we express them as your teachings. Amen.